Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends wherever you are, dear kind speaker and dear listener or participant in this webinar. My name is Abdulaziz Sagir. I'm the chairman of the Gulf Research Center. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all. And today we have a very distinguished panelist in this webinar that we are organizing to talk and discuss about the Ukraine-Russian crisis and its impact on the Gulf, from political security, economics, and energy. I'm sure many people are interested to learn about the impact of such a crisis. We have with us today here from my right side, Professor Giacomo Luciani, who is a professor of energy, also political economy, but also he's a member of the board of trustees of the Gulf Research Center, and also he teaches at Sciences Po and the ASHI, the Geneva Graduate Institute. Dr. John Sfakinakis, he's the chief economist of the Gulf Research Center and the director of the economic programs, which welcome, John. Dr. Christian Koch is the director of research at the Gulf Research Center, based in Brussels, also with us today. And Dr. Mustafa Al-Ani, who is the director of security, and he's a senior advisor, of course, at the Gulf Research Center, but also he's the director of the Security and Defense Study at the Gulf Research Center. Today, we hope we'll have a great discussion on looking at the different aspects of the impact of the crisis on the region. Hopefully, that we can find some of the important issues and some of the policies that we need to look at, address, and the way how things is going to develop in the different scenario. I'm not going to take much of your time, but I would like to thank all of those participants with us. I will leave them moderating. Dr. Christian Koch will moderate the talk, and then those whom they have questions, they know what to do, and he's going to give you all the logistical and the housekeeping issues that important to know. Thank you all, and look forward for a good webinar. All the best.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sagar, and a good day also, and warm welcome from my side for joining us today in this webinar, which is entitled The Crisis of Ukraine in the Gulf, Security, Economic, and Energy Repercussions. It really is my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion with our excellent panel of speakers. The war in Ukraine has been going on for full-fledged for over 3 weeks now, and I think its effects have certainly been felt worldwide, and not limited only to Europe. So whether in terms of the fighting itself, the role of Russia in the European and global security order, the geopolitical and geo-economic shifts that are occurring as a result of the Russian decision to invade Ukraine, and of course the impact on global economics, global energy markets, supply chains. All of this, bottom line, is that the implications and consequences are indeed far-reaching. Some of those impacts can already be seen. Others are developing as we speak, and are subject to how the conflict will continue over the coming weeks. I think the Middle East and the Gulf does find itself in quite a precarious position. On the one hand, the Middle East itself, of course, continues to be embroiled in numerous ongoing conflict situations, stretching from Libya to Syria, Iraq, Yemen. And while the GCC states have been recently engaged in efforts at de-escalation, trying to build communication channels among conflicting parties. Here's some examples are the Saudi-Iran talks that have happened in Iraq, levels of rapprochement happening with Turkey, and just the GCC initiative announced just a few days ago to convene a meeting with all Yemeni parties. I think those are just some examples of that de-escalation strategy. But the outcome, of course, of those efforts remain quite uncertain. And with Russia playing a direct role in these countries, I think the future trajectory of these conflict situations has been thrown further into doubt. Now, the direct impact of the Ukraine crisis can only be seen with regard to one of the central issues of concerns for the GCC states, which is the future of the Iran nuclear agreement and the steps needed to follow if an agreement on the return to the JCPOA is reached. Recently, Russia's insistence on written guarantees regarding the sanctions impact on Moscow's own ties to Iran have delayed an agreement that most analysts thought would already happen by now. And while an agreement still looks likely, the discussions to follow on the JCPOA, to bringing Iran and GCC states into a wider agreement on regional security mechanisms that deal then with Iran's wider role in the region, are certainly uncertain, given the role that Russia might now seek to play. With the regional balance of power already undergoing shifts, countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been criticized by Western media in particular for their so-called hedging policy of not coming out clearly to cut ties to Russia as a result of the invasion. The UAE Foreign Minister, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, is in fact in Moscow today for talks with Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov. So this is certainly one aspect that we want to elaborate on in our discussions today. Outside of the geopolitics, economic and energy issues, of course, play a key and significant role when evaluating the repercussions of the Ukraine crisis for the Gulf region. The recent dramatic spike in oil prices has led to calls by the United States and others for the Arab Gulf oil producers to raise their production levels, something these countries have been reluctant to do immediately, also given the existing OPEC plus framework, to which Russia is, of course, a main partner. The Gulf's overall economic ties have been shifting steadily eastwards over the past decade, and given the priority being given to continued diversification programs, recovery in the post-COVID phase, economic considerations play a key role for GCC decision makers in the context of the current crisis. So at the same time, it is also not in the interest of the Arab Gulf states to see oil prices continue to climb, as this has broader implications in terms of the overall energy transition. So we have a host of issues to consider today, and I'm very happy to have three key GRC analysts joining me to give us their thoughts and reflections on some of the issues I have mentioned and more. Dr. Sagar has already introduced them at the outset, so I will not go into detail further. It's just a pleasure to have all three with them here in our webinar today. Each of them will provide us with sort of brief remarks of 7 to 8 minutes, which will then be followed by a discussion round with our audience. Please do submit your questions to the chat function in Zoom. I believe we are all too familiar now how these systems work. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask your question in person, and then we can bring you online to pose those questions. I just want to point out that this event is on the record and is being recorded. And then, without further ado, let me call on Mustafa to start us off and give us a little bit an overview of some of the geopolitics involved as far as the Ukraine crisis is concerned. Mustafa, please.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I will try to reflect the view from the Gulf, from the GCC point of view on the question of Ukraine crisis. First, it's not this crisis we feel here in the region does not constitute a strategic threat to the GCC state for a number of reasons. One of them is the question of geography. It is not an immediate threat. It's not a strategic threat. We have no strategic engagement with Ukraine before a crisis. So it is not a direct strategic threat. And this gives the leadership a margin, basically, to try to find a suitable or profitable position to position yourself in this crisis. So because there is no strategic threat, the decision was taken not collectively, but individually, but there is a general agreement on this decision that the GCC will take a neutral stand in this conflict. The problem faced is, can you take this neutral stand in this sort of very sensitive situation, highly charged situation, when you are counted on one side? Historically, you are allied with one side in this conflict. Can you basically take a neutral stand? A neutral stand is taken for a number of reasons. There is no intention to upset Russia. You have to remember, in the past 5-6 years, the GCC relation with Russia was growing. Yes, it's not economically, but again, diplomatic relation is growing. And there is a lot of contact with the Russian leadership, and on hope of joint investment, possibly buying arms, this and that. On the other hand, there's a problem with the relation with the United States. So the neutrality stand came from the fact that you don't want to take an open, clear, hostile attitude toward the American or the West in general. At the same time, you don't want to take a stand which is going to destroy your relation with Russia. The problem with a neutral stand is how long you can maintain it. The conflict is increasing, and the pressure is increasing on you from all sides, and your ability to maintain this sort of stand and to play on the margin, I think is getting narrow every day, and the possibility that you will be forced at one point to decide on which side you are standing. And in my judgment, I cannot see, with all, I am accepting the fact that the Americans not doing good in the region, and they are not a good friend in the region. But the major question, can you dispense with the American? Are the Russian going to be a replacement? All this question going to be faced when you're going to change your stand and you're going to basically move away from the neutrality under pressure. I believe at the end of the day, the GCC have to side with the United States and the West in general, whether they like it or not. I will stop here.
Great. Thank you, Mustafa. That's a very clear sort of analysis of where you see a situation at the moment. And I'm sure that we will get into more details then in the discussion to follow. Let me bring in John at this stage and focus a little bit on some of the economic consequences and repercussions. We know that the region is going through a variety of diversification programs. Saudi Arabia places huge emphasis on success of Vision 2030. We're also coming out of what can be considered sort of the post-COVID phase in economic recovery. So where do you see the main economic repercussions from this crisis, and how does that impact the Gulf overall? John, please.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much. So in a way, this is kind of a reprieve, I would say, for the oil-producing countries, especially for the Gulf, because obviously when oil goes up, that is very good news in terms of state revenues. And I think no doubt if oil stays at these levels and it doesn't go much higher, they will end up more or less all of the Gulf states with a surplus. Fiscally, they should be fine for this year. Probably they'll have higher GDP. That would lead them not to force any debt to be issued both locally and internationally, which has been accumulating over the last few years. So there is less of a demand to issue debt. Overall, the macro picture looks good. And in terms of inflation, all of them seem to have less than what the global economy is facing today, although they will eventually get impacted by imported inflation over the short to medium term. So overall, I think it's good news. And I think the region is better cushioned to face this kind of higher oil price, because the question remains, will they spend it or spend it all like they did back in 2008, 2009, when we saw a similar increase in the oil price? And the answer is that no, they will not. I think they're taking measures to save a lot of this money and you can look at this throughout the Gulf, a lot of the money will be saved in Saudi Arabia. It's not going to be spent. In fact, Saudi Arabia will have the lowest capex expenditure for this year and next year. And in fact, they will maintain a very disciplined approach to spending, both inside and outside of Saudi Arabia. And the same goes for Qatar, although Qatar will spend a bit more given that they have the World Cup, and the same for the UAE. But overall, the region is better cushioned to withstand more difficulties. And the difficulties are not just the oil price, you know. It really has to do with what is happening outside of the region. And clearly, outside of the region, there is an acute concern about a global recession. So the issue is not if it happens, but when it happens. And I think the region is taking appropriate measures since 2018-19 with the implementation of VAT and other measures, energy price increases and so forth. And I think if you look at the numbers, in terms of purchasing power parity, the region has less. So the region is not getting more affluent, the region is getting less affluent in PPP terms. And that is something that the leadership in all the GCC countries is taking note of. And that is very important. So in terms of purchasing power, the region has less, citizens have less. Throughout the Gulf, we have seen measures, whether it is VAT or otherwise, that creates these non-oil revenues, but then these non-oil revenues mean that consumers have less money to spend. And I think this is the new reality of the Gulf. Yes, oil prices have benefited the coffers of these states, but there is less money going around. So I think we need to decipher that this is a very different oil price party that is happening than what we've seen in 2008, 2009. And that is to the recognition of the leaders that do admit that this is something that a lot of these countries have to take note of. Also, there is monetary tightening happening. The Fed released yesterday one of its probably 7 or 9 decisions. The Fed is going to be increasing very aggressively. The Bank of England just announced tightening, and this is going to be the theme for 22 and 23, and the Gulf states will have to do the same. We don't know what the impact will be in terms of the severity of higher cost of capital, but certainly that has an impact on credit growth in the Gulf, meaning that the cost of capital will increase, private sector will be impacted, definitely whether now or later. So monetary tightening is not helping. In fact, it's complicating the oil price hike and the higher revenues. Now, is there compensation that is taking place? So on the one hand, you have higher oil income, and on the other, you have higher cost of capital. It is compensating, but as I said, this is on the back of 3-4 years of measures that is decreasing over time incomes in the hand of citizens. And on top of it, if you add inflation and the possibility of maybe higher inflation for the global economy, that will be imported in terms of food and other items, which the Gulf is very dependent. So dependence on food imports is a downside risk. Not a huge one, not similar to that of Egypt, but still it's there. So I would say that one would need to see this higher oil price environment in view of what the region has done. And I think the region is better prepared to face this either global recession or imported stagflation with a better measurable policy at hand than what we had seen in 2008, 2009. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you very much, John, for that very succinct overview. So what I'm basically getting is sort of quite a positive short-term development because of the high oil prices and the fact that the GCC states are being smarter of how to deal with this income, but still a number of uncertain factors in the medium term, given how this crisis in Ukraine might proceed further in terms of global recession, inflationary pressures, et cetera, So something to still watch very closely. Giacomo, I want to bring you in then on the energy front. Of course, energy is the big topic here where I sit in Belgium, looking at the gas prices. We see that being in the discussion overall in terms also of the pressure on, we've mentioned it before, the pressure on Gulf Arab producers to increase their production levels in order to have an impact on the oil price. Why don't you come in and give us a little bit your overall assessment on the energy repercussions that we see and where will this take us? I just need you to unmute.
Thank you, Christian. The crisis that we are facing is a political crisis, only partially an energy crisis. There was an energy crisis developing beforehand, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was due to the fact that over the past few years, investment in oil and gas production has been insufficient. The companies, major international companies, have been criticized for investing too much in old energy sources, and they are sensitive to the criticism that they have received, and therefore, in general, insufficient investment has gone into upstream oil and gas. So that was underlying, and there was a tendency to higher oil prices, which had been looked at from OPEC plus, and there was a schedule of increasing production. So that is the proper energy side of the crisis. Then there is a political overlay following the Ukraine invasion, the invasion of Ukraine. And that is extremely important and has to be well understood. In the sense that the European governments and the United States have been surprised, especially the European governments, have been surprised by an aggressive behavior, an intolerably bullish behavior on the part of the Russian government, with total disregard for human rights and for the rights of the civilian population in Ukraine, total disregard for the sovereignty of Ukraine, implementing a kind of behavior which was not at all expected in Europe, at this time and date. You might say the European governments have been blind because all the signs were very visible. The writing was on the wall. The behavior of Putin in Syria, the occupation of Crimea, the continuing fueling of local conflict opponents, both within and outside of Russia. All of these are very important signs that Russia, and especially the Putin regime, is not interested in behaving in ways that we consider acceptable. It has effectively become a rogue state. Now, the decision has ensued to drastically reduce the dependence of Europe from Russian oil and gas and coal, but coal, is less important. And in general, I think it's not only reducing the dependence on oil and gas, but it is a decision to unwind and undo all the process of economic interrelationship. It affects all sectors, not just the energy sector. And it boils down to the belief that the old narrative whereby trade would encourage peaceful behavior has proven wrong. And trade with countries that conform to certain standards of behavior, which may not necessarily mean being democratic, but certainly means conforming to standards of behavior which refrain from aggressive military action and respect human rights. Now, and only with these countries you will engage in real, profound economic intercourse. Now, in a sense, there is no new energy crisis. The gas is flowing from Russia. The oil is flowing out of Russia, but we have decided not to buy it. We have decided that we will reduce our dependence from Russia. And I believe, in perspective, from all governments that from all countries and all regimes that, like Russia, are not sufficiently respectful of certain behavior that we deem necessary for peaceful coexistence in this world. So what will happen is that Russian gas, dependence on Russian gas will be reduced drastically at a cost, at a significant cost, because in the immediate it is difficult to find alternatives, but alternatives are coming up. There are new LNG projects in the United States that will be ready next year. There are new large LNG capacities that will be ready in Qatar in 2024. There is a possibility of increasing production of gas within Europe, which had been declining, in some cases deliberately reduced, as in the case of Netherlands. All of this can be overturned and has the potential of alleviating. And then we can reduce dependence on gas by going back to coal to some extent, and also by keeping the nuclear capacity that is due to be retired in some countries, notably in Germany. For the time being, the German government is still saying that they will retire the 3 remaining nuclear power plants. I'm not convinced that when we get to the point, this decision will be maintained. Perhaps postponed by a few months, but it might very well be postponed. So that is for gas. In the case of oil, we are already, there is no embargo on Russian oil officially, but what is happening is that companies are just not buying it. And that is in part because it's so difficult due to the financial sanctions, and in part also because buying Russian oil carries such a stigma that companies don't want to be seen to do that. The experience of Shell, that bought a cargo of Russian oil and then was obliged to apologize for having done so and officially state that it was a mistake, that it will not be repeated. That is extremely important. I don't think many countries want to, many companies want to be in the same position. So I think that is what is happening. It does not necessarily mean that global oil demand will increase. I think global oil demand will not increase, partly because the price is already very high, partly because the economy, as John said beforehand, is not growing fast at the moment. And the tightening of monetary policies will slow down growth. So I don't see a large global imbalance between demand and supply of oil. And if the situation is well managed, I think the sentiment of the market may very well change. And in fact, the price is falling already. And it has potentially a good way to fall further. So I am not a believer in extremely high oil prices. But, of course, everything is possible. If the crisis is not well managed, then maybe we will have a very high oil price. What I think is important from the point of view of the Gulf is that, it should be understood that the position of neutrality is untenable. In not only the neutrality with respect to this conflict, this specific conflict, but behavior that is not deemed as acceptable on the part of any one of the Gulf governments, not deemed as acceptable in Europe, will lead inevitably to negative consequences for economic interaction. The comments that have been proposed concerning the visit of Boris Johnson in the region and the fact that essentially he has failed, he has not obtained increase in oil, a promise to increase oil production. And in any case, he had already been criticized because he was going to request the assistance of governments that are not sufficiently acceptable to the eyes of many Europeans. This is something that needs to be considered very seriously. In the past, governments were ready to compromise very easily, but I think this has radically changed. It has very significant costs, and the future is going to be very much different from the past.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Giacomo, for those insights. I want to encourage our audience, of course, to keep posting questions into the chat, and I've already seen this. A couple of them have already been listed. There's also one person who's lifted their hand, so I will go to them very shortly. Let me address each of you with just one quick question. Let me start with Mustafa for a second here. Mustafa, do you see now, as a result of Ukraine, the perception of Russia in the region changing somewhat? When they interfered in Syria, they were cited sort of as an example that Russia was back in the Middle East, that Russia was a decisive actor that's willing to stand by its allies, unlike, for example, Obama's red line policy in Syria or much of Europe. Is this now shifting? And where do you maybe see the long-term outlook in terms of Russia-Gulf relations from that point of view?
I think that the Russian position in Syria are going to be under a huge pressure. I don't think the NATO can live long with the fact that the Russians have one of the major air base and naval base on their southern border, Turkey. It is just 170 kilometers from Incirlik, which is one of the largest NATO nuclear base. So I don't see, I think that the Ukrainian crisis will have impact on the Russian position and influence and present. in Syria. For the Gulf state, in the beginning, they thought that the Russian going to help in settling the crisis in Syria. Prove after 7 years is not really, it is part of the problem, not a part of the resolution, So I don't see there is, they are keen to maintain the Russian presence in Syria. But the fact that how they look at the Russia is completely different. They look at the Russian, in general, the Mr. Putin position, that they hope that he's going to be counterbalanced to the US, and they can use the Russian to send a message to the United, to the American and to the West in general, a protest letter message saying that your policy is not acceptable, and we have opportunity now to do something by siding with the Russian or helping the Russian. But I don't think this is sustainable. I don't think it's sustainable. It's going to be very difficult, and we can see, I mean, the visit of the British Prime Minister to Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. I think he is a messenger for the United States, and he carrying a message of warning, a strong warning to this government that there is a limitation and there is a red lines, and the American will not, or in general, the West in general will not accept anything beyond that. So I think that if the question is that, the pressure going to bring result, I think the pressure will bring result.
Oh, great. Thank you for that. Let me turn to John for a second here. You already mentioned, John, that at the moment, the GCC countries are in a better position economically. I'm wondering whether this, a little bit more positive economic situation is also allowing some of the Gulf countries at the moment to resist a little bit this pressure to take a side in the conflict. And then what does that mean then overall for sort of medium-term economic links also to Russia? As it was mentioned, there's been more investment into this relationship in recent years, more economic ties, some investment funds being set up. There's still this idea of Russia also supplying military equipment to the Gulf states, maybe because that military equipment then comes at a cheaper price. But now that we have these layers and layers of sanctions being applied to Russia, where do you see the economic relationship with Russia maybe going in the near term?
No, right. Okay. So it's, first of all, there are a couple of things. The Gulf states, not all of them were fast in approaching Russia on the economic front. In fact, the largest economy was quite slow. Besides doing ceremonial visits, its investment appetite on the ground was quite limited. And by that, I refer to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, out of the three that expressed interest in investing in Russia, actually invested the lowest amount. This is since 2016. The UAE and Qatar were the ones that invested the highest amount. And actually the UAE invested the most. So they are the ones that need to wonder what happens to their investments. And of course, the fate of those investments will be similar to those in the West. You cannot repatriate any of your funds if bank accounts are frozen, and you cannot use SWIFT to wire money. So that is a very difficult thing. And especially as we come out of the war and we go into the post-war crisis, asset freezes, and how do you manage the repatriation of assets? I think lawyers will have a party first before anything else. So that's a difficult thing. And The ones who are probably going to be the losers are Qatar and the UAE much more than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia did a very cautious approach. And I think that is what Saudi Arabia has done and learned its lesson from many years prior to 2016 and 15, when they would have been far more quick in investing money. So that's one. Let me also say something related to this, because one of the questions is asking about grain prices and how they could affect MENA. Now, definitely, this is where the issue is. For a country like Egypt, which is completely dependent, and it's similar for the rest of the Gulf, with probably the exception of Saudi Arabia that produces around 2% of its wheat needs. Besides that 2%, the rest is all imported, predominantly from Ukraine, some of it from Russia, but also from other sources. Egypt, unfortunately, imports all of its grain needs from Ukraine and Russia. So they are hard pressed, but more recently, Egypt has been able to secure wheat supplies from Romania. And they went to see if France is an option, but French wheat is quite expensive. So will this lead into a crisis? As you know, President Sisi visited a few days ago Mohammed bin Salman, and the visit was not just a courtesy visit. It very much had to do with how do they manage the crisis, and if Saudi Arabia will be able to provide support. And that is a crucial issue because budgetary-wise, Egypt will have a substantial deficit this year, and they do have a real crisis at hand if one, wheat prices keep on rising, and two, the supply of wheat is found to be difficult. I don't think we're yet there, but the Egyptians do worry. And it will become, Patrick, a crisis for the GCC if there is a global crisis in wheat and food. Then it will become a much bigger crisis, because not only will the Gulf have to bail out some of the other Middle Eastern states that are hard pressed with budget and sourcing imports and food imports in particular, but then what happens with their own fiscal situation. I don't think we're yet there, but we do believe that this is a far different crisis than the one we witnessed in 2011. So will it harm the Gulf? Yes, it could harm the Gulf as we get into these unknowns. So that's all I wanted to say about this. Thank you, Christian.
Excellent. Thank you, John. And a short question to Giacomo. Where do you see the dynamics within the OPEC Plus framework sort of developing in the short term? A lot of times sort of now, again, Saudi Arabia is being portrayed as if they simply make a decision to produce more oil, this will have an immediate huge impact on the oil price. And I'm just wondering how the market dynamics have a little bit maybe changed over the decades. You know, this might have applied in the 1980s, but I think Saudi Arabia has maybe a little bit of a different approach to this scenario, and doesn't want to be seen as the one who can just simply jump in and make that impact. And is it even in a position to do so? Maybe you can just elaborate on that for a bit. Again, I need you to unmute.
Yes. First of all, let me say, clarify one important point, and that is that the sanctions have been precipitated by the invasion of Ukraine, but they are not contingent on the solution of the Ukrainian conflict. In other words, no one is envisaging lifting those sanctions if the Russians withdraw. You know, what is done is done, and the decision to drastically reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas will stay for the long run, okay? Maybe we will not reach total independence, total cancellation of all imports of oil and gas, but a substantial, drastic reduction is certainly going to be pursued independently of what happens in Ukraine. Now, Saudi Arabia can increase production, has some margin to increase production, not a huge margin. And we have seen in the past that announcements about increases in production have been considered irrelevant or insufficient by the market and have not led to a reduction in prices. The market, the oil market and the oil price is very much influenced by sentiment. Sentiment is something difficult to define, but what this means is that there is a large area of uncertainty about the oil price, an area of non-definition. The oil price today is close to 100, a bit less, but it could very well be 60, okay? Or it could very well be 150. And basically the fundamentals, supply and demand, would not change. There is no direct one-to-one relationship between the balance of supply and demand and the price. The price is defined by the sentiment within this broad band. A few months back, Rystad, which is a very well established and reputed consultancy, estimated that the world can have all the oil that it needs with a price of $55 per barrel. So at the moment, you know, we are not quite twice as much, but close. So the price, in a sense, is unnecessarily high. Okay. Now the question is, it all depends on the sentiment, and the sentiment can change if companies are convinced that they need to continue to invest, and the public is convinced that this is a necessity and they should not discourage the companies from continuing to invest, and governments take measures to reduce consumption. There are numerous measures that can be taken to convince or force consumers to use less oil. There is very significant potential for using less oil. It goes from heating your homes less and certainly driving less with your private car and using more of public transportation. There's a range of policies that may be taken. Now, if the market sees that governments are serious about containing oil consumption, and companies are serious about investing more in other areas of the world which are not Russia, then sentiment could potentially change quite rapidly. And so that would mean that the price, instead of being close to the upper maximum in the range of indefinition, would possibly be close to the lower boundary of the range of indefinition. You know, the price might easily be 60 or 65. It would still be very convenient to invest in oil in many parts of the world, and oil would be flowing. So that's the point. Of course, the behavior of Saudi Arabia is part of the story, but it's not the only, possibly not the most important chapter.
Excellent, very, very interesting. If I can ask all of our panelists to sort of have an eye on the chat, on the Q&A, you'll see the questions there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me now try to bring in one of our participants, Adel Abdurrahman Khalif. I hope I pronounced that correctly. You wanted to come in with a question, and please I'll allow you now to come in, and please keep your statement also short.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you well.
Hi. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to drop in a question. I'll make it very, very short. I think that it's true that when I was following all your analysis from each gentleman here, I think everything was said in a very, very clear and a very, very advanced analysis in a way. However, I feel like we haven't really focused a lot enough on the position of the Gulf itself for what's coming next. And I think that on this basis, I just would like to mention this very quickly. I think everybody noticed yesterday the declaration made by the American President Joe Biden when he declared that he considers Vladimir Putin a war criminal. We all also agree that the action of invasion of Russia on Ukraine is unacceptable, and it's just something completely unacceptable for 2022. However, I think that a country like Saudi Arabia today is going to be a key player, and I think that a country like Algeria is going to be a key player as well, because I would like to go back very quickly to what Giacomo said earlier when he was speaking about the dependency of Europe on the Russian gas. Giacomo's statement was very, very good, especially when he said that Europe needs to reduce its dependency on the Russian gas. Personally, I feel that Europe made the strategic mistake by not thinking about this earlier. They relied too much on Russian gas and never thought about, multiplying and securing other supplies. On this basis, I would like to remind everyone that Algeria, for example, is a major key player in that region, because Algeria is a major gas producer. And Italy recently went, the Italian Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs went to Algeria requesting more gas. Spain relies a lot on Algeria. So I think that knowing that Algeria has a very good strategic relationship with Russia, this will put certain European countries in a standby mode and not give and declare their position against Russia publicly too quickly. This is why I think that country like Saudi, especially Saudi Arabia, in my mind, has the most stable political situation today and the most stable diplomatic situation, because it's a perfect referee and a perfect actor that could play a major role in de-escalation of this crisis between Russia and Ukraine, because Saudi Arabia has a fantastic relationship with America, with Europe, with its neighbors, and has also a very good relationship with Algeria. So I think that we are seeing now more Russian billionaires moving to the Middle East in consequences of what they are facing as sanctions in Europe.
Excuse me, can I interject here? What is the question? Because I don't think we're doing a service to everyone else.
Yes, my question is, do you think that Saudi, as a leader in the Gulf, has the capacity today to be the major actor in the de-escalation of this conflict, given its perfect position politically and economically?
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me go to Giacomo maybe first on this, because I know, Giacomo, you also have to go teach again in about 10 minutes and leave us. So I'll bring you in, and then maybe also come back to both Mustafa and John. Giacomo.
I think basically the expectation that individual European governments would follow divergent lines and they would not stay the course and so on and so forth. This is exactly what Putin expected, and this is exactly the opposite of what we see today. It's always very easy to depict the European Union as constantly divided, quarreling, and so on and so forth. It is true under normal conditions, but then when the moment of decision comes, the European Union is united, and this is what the Russians discovered in this occasion. Sure, in the past there has been complacency, and the German government has been complacent in the sense that they were genuinely hoping that by promoting government interdependence, this would facilitate peace in Europe. It has not turned out this way. So the new tune in Berlin is quite different. I think people learn out of experience. And in this case, it's very clear.
Thanks. Mustafa, because you talked at the beginning that ultimately you think that the GCC states will have to rally behind the United States in this equation. So this hedging policy, is this something that, how long can this continue? Where do you see this going?
You have to understand, Saudi Arabia involved in very unsettled conflict war in Yemen. And it is still, this conflict is still mainly military conflict. Military conflict, here come the American dimension, because 99% of the Saudis' military capability is basically linked to the American supplier and American support. So I don't see here, if I am sitting in Riyadh, yes, I wish to maintain neutrality. I wish to send Mr. Biden a message, a protest message about a number of things, about not controlling the Iranian behavior, about the question of not recognizing the crown prince, about, okay, I have a long list to protest to Mr. Biden, but and I found this is an opportunity, but how long and how wide this opportunity is open can be used. I doubt, I mean, if I am sitting in Riyadh, I am in very difficult position, and I cannot maintain neutrality for long under this sort of circumstances and this sort of pressure. And at the end of the day, I have to take side. And when I'm going to take side, I have to take the American side. There is no other option. It is not out of love. It is not out of belief. It is out of necessity and interest.
Yeah. Thank you, Mustafa. I think this is going to be an issue that will continue to confront the Gulf states. John, you want to come in on this a little bit, and then maybe also just, because we're getting sort of short on time, handle some of these questions that we see in the chat also about China. Saudi prospects of selling China's oil in yuan, Chinese overall role and the economic ties that the region has been developing. I mean, we have this issue of Russia, and Russia not being the replacement for the US, but down the horizon I see China as being maybe a much more different player than maybe what Russia is today. So where do you see that from that front?
Right. I mean, plenty of people have spoken about this China-Saudi relationship and so forth. This is, I think, a perpetual and perennial question that we will be hearing and discussing until something happens. Obviously, the majority of Saudi Arabia's oil and of the Gulf goes towards Asia. The US does not import. In fact, the US exports oil. So long gone has the relationship been with the US and Saudi on the energy front. In the early 2000s, a lot of it used to go, now it no longer goes. So that is a new dynamic, obviously. Now, is this being replaced? I think it will be really a mistake to think that the relationship is one that is being replaced by another. The American relationship cannot be replaced because it is a geo-military relationship. The Chinese, yes, is a relationship of convenience and commercial ties. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf export oil, and they import a lot of products from China. Now, is this opportune moment to be discussing the pricing of oil that Saudi Arabia sells in renminbi and yuan? to be, is it coincidental in a sense? And I don't think it is coincidental. But the Americans do perceive this announcement as being something of a sort of a noise. And if this is meant with actual implementable policy, which Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf want to do, that is something that Washington will take quite seriously at a time when we're facing a global recession, when discussions about currencies are going to receive the forefront, and a lot of people in Washington at a time when the Gulf should be looking for friends is trying to find a friend in China. So I don't think that that is coming at a zero cost. And so we really need to be mindful of that relationship, because I don't think one needs to be very quick in discarding that relationship. So yes, I think that truly one needs to be careful in how these two get balanced out. Now, let me finish by saying one thing about the question asked about is Saudi Arabia a possible leader from here on? It really all depends, Adil, on the issue of oil price. If oil prices stay high and they go from here on to further highs, then Saudi Arabia has a chance and an opportunity to capture the moment. But that opportunity needs to have an interlocutor that listens. And I'm not quite sure that the Europeans yet want to listen to Saudi Arabia. And of course, Washington and Biden do not yet want to listen to Saudi Arabia, which is not music to the ears of Riyadh. But it all depends. If oil goes to $50, then there isn't much to lead, right? Because you take much power from the price of oil and your decisions and the decisions you take. Because at the same time, if Saudi Arabia decides not to increase, and the same for the Gulf, production of oil, then you lose in terms of your branding and your capacity to have this dialogue. If you decide to be one-sided and not have a dialogue, then you don't have much power, do you? And this is where I want to end. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much, John. The hour has already passed. I think we've had a fascinating discussion. I very much enjoyed that point of yours, John, at the end, where we have to stop seeing things in either or kind of terms, one being the replacement for another. But we've talked about a lot of these issues today. I think all of our speakers were extremely succinct and to the point. And I think this is really useful analysis for everybody. Giacomo has already had to leave us because he has to teach a class, but I very much enjoyed having him on board and also appreciate his comments. So thank you to you, John. Thank you to you, Mustafa, for being available today. To our audience, I very much hope that you enjoyed our discussions. We will, of course, as the GRC, continue handling many of these topics in our analysis. So please also continue to follow us via the various social media channels that we have available. And we will also keep you informed about our next activities and webinars that we will be hosting in the near future. For now, I wish everybody a good rest of the day, wherever you may be, and thank you for joining us, and see you soon at another GRC event. Goodbye.